Alright, so let's get started on the government. And there's going to be basically two functions of the government. The first one is going to be government purchases, so things that they're buying or spending money on. And the second one is how they're bringing this money in, and that's going to be through taxation. Alright, so government purchases of goods and services are part of desired aggregate expenditures. All that means is that capital G is part of the right-hand side of the AE function, so it's part of aggregate expenditures. Again, we want to be really sure that we're not including transfer payments in these government purchases of goods and services, in that we're not counting money that's just being moved from one person to another. So we don't include that because that's not actually a purchase, it's just moving money around. So that's that first part, first side of government. The first job of government is to purchase things, in this model. The second role of government in this model, maybe role is a better word, the second role of government is to tax. And the net tax revenues the government brings in this model is going to be represented by capital T. So those are going to be total tax revenues net of transfer payments. So again, we're not including transfer payments here. Okay, so let's first make an assumption about taxes on this next slide. And so we're assuming that net taxes, there's no lump sum taxes, that basically how the taxes are working is they're taking a certain percentage of the national income. So here, capital T equals little t times y. And little t, or lowercase t, is this next tax rate, is this net tax rate, I should say. So think of that as like a 10% tax rate would mean that little t is 0.1. A 20% tax rate means that little t is 0.2, which means, it's constants no matter what the level of y, this tax rate doesn't change. So we're always taxing like a certain proportion of your income. So that's how taxes are going to work in this kind of simple model that we're talking about now. And so we can also think about we have government purchases and taxes, and we can think about whether the government's running a surplus or a deficit in their spending. And the balanced budget is going to be when, government purchases equal net tax revenue. So this is going to be obvious to a lot of you, is that if government purchases are less than the tax revenue you bring in, you have a budget surplus. Your tax revenue is more than your spending, you have a surplus. On the other hand, kind of what we're more used to in, especially in provincial politics, but also federally more recently, we have budget deficits in the sense that government purchases or government spending on goods and services is going to be greater than the net tax revenue they bring in. There's nothing in this model that says we need a balanced budget. The governments could be running budget surplus or deficits. That's just going to be a result of kind of the level of government purchases and the tax rate. So before we move on or kind of recap what the government looks like in this model, it's really an important point to make that we're modeling all forms of government together in the sense that capital G is all the purchases of goods and services by the federal government, by provincial governments, by municipal governments. We're kind of grouping all of them together. So we're not separately modeling different levels of government. And this is going to be especially true, especially important in Canada, in the sense that in Canada, health and education are under provincial jurisdiction for the most part, except in reserves. So it's going to be really important to think about that. Government purchases and spending are all these things added up. And so that's what this kind of slide just makes that point. So before we move on to net exports and kind of foreign trade in this model, let's kind of just give a quick recap about what the government looks like and what taxation looks like and kind of how it looks like in terms of our equations of our model. So I'm just going to click on OneNote here so we can talk about it. All right, so again, we have this AE function, so this desired level of aggregate expenditure, and that has four kind of different elements on this right-hand side. So let's keep them in the same order. So C plus I plus G plus NX. So these are the four kind of categories or major categories of expenditure that we think about for GDP, and so this is the theoretical equivalent. And so last week what we did is we talked about consumption function having this form, like we talked about at the beginning of these videos. We talked about how investment was some constant. Now what we're doing is we're introducing government purchases, which again are just this constant. So it's just some level of government purchases that they could increase their purchases, they could cut their purchases, they could maintain them, and that's going to change this level of G0. So it's going to change this constant up or down as the government deciding to purchase more, or spend more money, or spend less. So that's government purchases. That's the first kind of role of government. And the second was taxes. So remember we talked about taxes being equal to little t times y. So this was net taxes. This was the tax rate. And this was national income. So why taxes, or how taxes are going to work their way into the model here, is that disposable income, if we remember, is like after-tax income. So think about YD being equal national income minus your taxes. And so now disposable income in our society is Y minus little t times Y, just using this identity here that we just came up with. Now we can just kind of collect these terms, and we have 1 minus t times y equals yd. So in a sense, if I'm just going to scroll down here a bit, our consumption function, which used to be a plus b times yd, now equals c a plus b times 1 minus t times y. So notice that the second part of the consumption function has changed, and in particular, kind of what the induced part of consumption has changed due to taxes. So that's something to keep in mind when we solve this whole model. We'll go over this again, but that's kind of how we've changed the model so far. Is we've introduced government. I'll just scroll up here. So we've introduced government. Government purchases are just some constant, and how taxes influence our equations is that they're going to change the consumption function. In particular, they're going to change the induced part of consumption if we just have this net tax rate and there's no lump sum taxes. So next what we're going to do is talk about foreign trade. So we're going to talk about this last term of the model, what that looks like, what pushes it up or down, and then we're going to throw all these things into a model and we'll solve it. And we're talking about how the model changes in equilibrium, and kind of different, two different fiscal policies that we could think about in this model.